Hey guys, thanks for checking out this video. We're going to do something a little bit different today. This will technically be an interview series, but instead of me speaking with one of our interpreters or somebody else in the language field, we're going to allow some of your questions to interview us as a business. So I will be specifically answering the questions, but what we've done is taken a handful of questions that have come in from online via the website or the social media, and we'll be addressing them. The main gist of that has been from customers or potential customers or just people who are interested in the field who want to know how to best work with an interpreter and what that looks like. So we've compiled a bunch of those questions, and I'm going to answer those right now. So we'll get into it and consider this. Okay, so the first question here is how to best work with the agency when requesting an interpreter. This presumes that you already have an existing relationship with the agency. And by that, I mean that you already have a signed contract, you're already working together. So let's say you've just signed up with an agency and now you're calling for the first time. What are they going to ask you? It's all of the who, what, where, why questions. So let's say that you're a doctor's office. We're going to need to know the date and time of the appointment, of course, name of the patient, name of the provider or individual that the patient will be working with, and type and duration of appointment. Now, we're going to use all of that information, of course, logistically to make sure that we have the interpreter there on time. But the reason that we're going to ask about the type of appointment is that there are obviously certain appointments that are more sensitive or might require a specific kind of interpreter with a certain background, or even, some patients are more comfortable with the same gender, given certain types of appointment, things like that. So we take all of that into consideration. So those are the things that we're going to want to know. And if you have those things ready, then we can just boom, boom, boom. We can make it a 30-second phone call, and then we'll give you a call back once everything is set up and you have the name of the interpreter for you. What we'll need from you in what we call a platform setting is much different than what we just discussed. So as opposed to a doctor's appointment where all we need is the who, what, where, when you're talking about, let's say, a theater setting or a graduation is on my mind because that's the time of year we're in right now. When an interpreter arrives on site, they're going to need a couple layers of support. First of all, for a big event, the interpreter is going to need to know where you want them to park. They're also going to need an on-site point of contact so that if they're walking into an arena, they're not just wandering around trying to find access to where they're going to be situated or things like that. So the agency will want to know somebody who's going to be on site and a cell phone that they can give, a cell phone number that they can give the interpreter for the day of so that they can get situated. Also, prep material. This is something that is going to be really critical for the interpreter to get ahead of time. So if you're talking about a theater or a commencement, any scripts or lists, speeches, any of that kind of stuff that the agency can get ahead of time is going to be incredibly useful. Now, that's not something that you have to have when you make the initial request. So if you're calling us for a play that's going to happen in a month, we don't need to have that script on that very first phone call, but we would like to get it ASAP so that the interpreter can have time to prep with it. The biggest thing to keep in mind when working with an interpreter who's actually on site is that they are more or less meant to be a tool of communication, not that they're an active participant in the communication itself. So make sure that you are speaking directly to the patient or business person, whoever it is that speaks a different language than you, and not speaking to the interpreter and then asking them to say it to the individual. You're having a conversation, and obviously the pacing is going to be a little bit different. You want to give the interpreter some time to hear what's being said and relay it, and then hear what you're saying and relay it back to the individual. But you don't want to make them an active part of the conversation, because they're not. They're just there for helping communicate between you and the other individual. Another piece of this is that often, because it's an unusual situation, people seem to think that interpreters are in one way caretakers or personally involved with the individual whom they are interpreting for. So if it's a doctor's appointment and a nurse or a doctor is asking a patient for date of birth or allergies or whatever may be the case, it's really important that you're not asking the interpreter that, because the interpreter is going to have no way of knowing those things. Just like the patient isn't going to ask the interpreter what your hours of operation are. How is the interpreter going to know that? The interpreter is there as a third party and doesn't have a personal connection. They may have a working relationship, of course, with either the consumer or the entity itself, the doctor's office. They may have worked there before, but they're not there as a representation of the office or of the patient. So it's just important to remember that they are essentially a neutral third party there solely for communication and not to provide input to either party about what is going on. Having said all that, the interpreter certainly is a resource if you have questions about interpreting in general, or just what is happening, or best ways in which to work with an interpreter. So an interpreter is certainly somebody who wants to provide resources that can help you as you move forward, working with a patient or just in the field in general. An interpreter is going to be a great resource. Now, it's not something you want to take them aside while the patient is talking or anything like that. But if there are some downtimes, certainly you can speak with the interpreter if you have questions in general. And if they have any resources for you or any information for you that's going to be useful, they'll definitely be happy to give it to you. So this touches a little bit on a question that we have already answered in terms of why do I have to pay for an interpreter? But beyond the why, most agencies you're going to work with, if not every agency, is going to have some sort of contract and agreement they're going to want you to sign in order to work with them. So it's really important that you read over that just like any other business contract. So when you contact an agency, let them know that you're interested in setting up services. Different agencies are going to have different services available to you. Some of them are entirely virtual. Some of them are entirely on-site, and then lots of other agencies, including Empire at this point, has a mixture of both. So you want to get that contract information, and read over it carefully. And once you have had a chance to actually get everything signed off on, go ahead and send it back. And at that point, you're pretty much ready to go. There are some agencies or entities out there that have subscriptions costs where you pay an annual fee, things like that. And other agencies where it's strictly you get billed per usage. So make sure that you pay real close attention to things like that. There are pros and cons to both for sure, but just make sure that you know what you're signing up for. And that is the first step before you even have to make a request. If you're in a situation where you can have either an on-site interpreter or an interpreter via video or telephone, I'm a little old school in my thinking, so I can't be totally biased in this. I always tend to think that having an interpreter on site is better for interpersonal dynamics and to make sure that information isn't being missed. Having said that, of course, there's a million things you have to factor in: time, costs, and largely it comes down to, if everything else is equal, what the individual is comfortable with. So there are certainly certain clients that would prefer to have an interpreter right there to work with them, especially in a medical setting. A lot of patients just prefer to have somebody right there, but there's also people that don't want to have that. So I think if all other things being equal, I would put the onus on the individual who is going to be utilizing the interpreter and say, what's your preference? Especially if this is like a walk-in situation where somebody comes into the emergency room, you can call for an interpreter. And if you're working with a good agency that has people available, you can probably have somebody there within half an hour. maybe that's fine for the individual and they would much rather wait for an interpreter to get there. But the opposite side of things is that you can say to them, well, we can wait until a live interpreter is here, or you can have somebody right now. And I would leave it up to them at that point. Again, there are times where you don't get that option. You're going with one or the other. But that would be my suggestion in terms of how to know whether to use somebody who's virtual or whether you use somebody who is physically on site. Yeah, please don't do this if at all possible. Using family members to act as an interpreter, we understand the impulse there that sometimes they've got somebody right here who speaks English or knows sign language, things like that. That is, it's a situation where people don't think that they're doing anything wrong. They're just trying to be helpful. Everybody involved is just trying to move this along, and we get that. But there are a lot of issues with having family members or friends interpret for the individual. One of which is that you just don't know this person's actual skill set. Being bilingual does not mean you're an interpreter. There are a lot of other things that go into it, years of training. So you don't actually know if your point is getting across. The second piece is that even if this is the most amazing interpreter in the world, if they have a personal relationship with this person, then you don't know what is or is not being conveyed because of that personal relationship. So if the doctor is talking about a long-term health issue and the let's call it the spouse is not inclined to share certain details. They think they're protecting, or they just can't cope with what's actually what's actually happening. You just don't know what's literally getting lost in translation. So you never ever want to do that. Of course, there are situations where in the immediate moment, if somebody comes in, if there is an emergency and you want to communicate immediately with somebody to ask them what happened, their name, so on and so forth, those situations are going to happen. But the moment that you can get a professional interpreter on site, it's going to be much, much better. That's similar to what we just talked about with family members. These are almost always people who are trying to do a good deed and are doing a good deed. They're doing a service, but the qualifications aren't going to be there. So you're putting at risk the safety of the patient or the quality of communication between yourself and this individual. So I I understand that there's no question that these people are helping, trying to help, and from a business's perspective, it makes all the sense in the world because, frankly, it's free, and that is more appealing than paying for a service. But you're going to get what you pay for in terms of quality. So I would suggest not doing that. Obviously, for somebody who works for a language service industry, works in the language service industry, that can be a self-serving answer. But the dangers are there in that the communication is just not going to be great. So much in the same way that you can take your car to your friend down the block and they might do a great job fixing your car, or the wheels might fall off the next time you get on the highway. It's kind of the same thing. Just because somebody has some knowledge, even high-end knowledge, doesn't mean that that you shouldn't go to a professional for it. So one of the really nice things about having working with an agency that has virtual options is that you can be comfortable knowing that just about any request for services can be met, regardless of the time frame. It just means that the options of whether it's live or virtual might not be there for you. So, for example, a lot of emergency rooms rely heavily on virtual interpreting, because if they need somebody right this second, it's one thing to call an agency and see how long it takes to get somebody there on site versus typing in a few keywords and having an interpreter pop up, or calling a certain phone number and having somebody just there available to you. But for other settings and in situations where you really would like to have somebody on site, the answer is generally as much notice as possible. So if you're talking about an event that is a few months away, great. Give the agencies a call. They're going to be able to help you out on that. If you're talking about something that is a couple of days away, most of the time, I shouldn't say that. A lot of the time, you're still going to be able to get help. No problem. So if you're calling an agency and hoping to get an on-site interpreter in a particular language tomorrow, you might have a tough time doing that because any of those interpreters who are local to that area or even within a couple hours radius have filled up their calendars pretty far in advance. So if you want to ensure that you can have somebody available on site for a particular event, it's always just the more the better in terms of notice. Get as much leeway as you can to the agencies, to the interpreter, get that interpreter reserved. Having said that, if you have something very last minute, always give the agencies a call because you never know whose calendar happens to be open or appointments that have canceled, things like that. So definitely give the agencies a chance to fill the request. Just know that the more time you can give them, the better. And the further out you give it, the more likely it is that you can have somebody definitely secured for whatever it is that you're calling for. We have another video already that addresses this question, but the very short answer is that there's two reasons why you have to, quote unquote, have to work with an interpreter. One is just the ethical implications of wanting to be able to speak with somebody, whether, especially in a medical setting, but in any other venue, you want to be able to communicate, you want to keep things inclusive. So it makes sense to have an interpreter. The other is that there are legal, I don't want to say ramifications because we're not talking about lawsuits here, but there are laws in place that require different entities to provide interpreters. So I can't speak just vaguely to anybody who's watching this on whether or not your business or whatever it is that you're doing it falls under the laws that require an interpreter. I would say it's likely most things do at this point, but speak with your legal representation. But that's the short answer, is that it's the right thing to do, and it's also typically the legal thing to do. Yeah, having said that, the the piece about legal action isn't something that an agency should be bringing to you. So there are advocacy firms out there who do make calls and fight for the rights of deaf and or LEP individuals. And that's great. They have their place, but they should not also be making money off of using that leverage. They should be acting as advocates, full stop. So if somebody calls you and says you have to use an interpreter for this individual for this setting, and they are applying any sort of pressure to you, that doesn't mean they're necessarily doing anything wrong. They may be absolutely right. And again, talk to your legal counsel about that. Having said that, if they follow up with so here are our rates and policies, that's a problem. That is obviously a conflict of interest. So if somebody is calling and saying, oh, we're trying to advocate for so-and-so, please use an interpreter, here's a list of places you can call, great. That is a conversation that might be something that you don't want to have, but is at least a legitimate one. If somebody is calling you and saying, you have to use our services, here's the price, otherwise there's going to be legal issues, that's really messy. And my suggestion would be to, again, figure out whether or not you are in fact obligated to provide those services. And if the answer is yes, to go elsewhere. That's a really complicated question. So there are, of course, differences just between agencies in terms of cost, but the bigger variables at play are going to be language, duration, location, and how much notice has been given. So what it'll cost you to have a on-site sign language interpreter in Syracuse, New York for a 1-hour doctor's appointment that you had a month notice on is going to be wildly different than what it would cost you to have a team of Portuguese interpreters who are working something for the UN in New York City and had 24-hour turnaround notice. And this will be something that is taped and broadcast to all different parts of the world. And it's an 8-hour event. So we can't even really give you a sense of what those numbers are going to be or what the cost differential will be. The big thing, I think, if that's a concern, is to do your homework, to look around and to talk to different agencies about, what their costs are, what they look like. I think what you're going to find is that depending on geographic location, you're going to find a general range, a ballpark amongst different agencies. The one thing I would warn you against is if you are finding that, I'm just making numbers up here, of course, but if you talk to 5 agencies and one of them is $10 an hour, another is 11, another is 9, another is 12, okay, that's all in the ballpark. If you find another one that is $4 an hour, something is problematic there. Likely, let's say something is likely problematic there, because that means their cost of doing business is so low that if they can offer those numbers to you, I would be concerned about the quality that you'd be getting. So at that point, everybody wants to find the best deal, and there's no problem with that. But I would start doing some research online about the different agencies, and the one that is such an outlier in terms of being such a great deal. And likewise, if you find somebody in that same scenario, if everybody else is clustered around $10 and now you find one that's 22, figure out what's going on there. So yeah, do some research. I wish I could give you firm numbers one way or the other, but just so much depends on where you are, what you're looking for, and all of these other factors. And I didn't even mention whether or not you can do online or a virtual or in person. That's also going to have a huge impact on the cost of things. So do some research, talk to the agencies, and they can give you a better idea of exactly what it's going to cost you. So there are ways to lessen the hit of the financial burden of it. Most of what we've seen has been through tax breaks at the end of the year. That's not something I am going to even try to speak intelligently on. Talk to your tax people, talk to your accountant, and they'll have a better sense of it. But there are options out there in terms of recouping some of the costs of using an interpreting service or entity. I think in our experience, the number one thing that we've seen in terms of ways to recoup it has been using it as a marketing tool. There are huge populations of people out there not being serviced because they are either deaf or non-English speaking. And if you are in a situation where you can now provide services to those individuals, there's obviously a cost upfront to working with somebody, but to be able to attract that much of an untapped customer base is actually where we found that the most money is to be recouped and or just made in terms of using a language service provider in the industry. So this is a pretty messy one. Certainly, a deaf or an LEP individual can request a specific interpreter, and they're allowed to do that. There's no question. Or they can. A lot of times, people want to work with a specific agency. Certainly, we've worked with many customers who book us and then say, "Actually, I'm sorry, this individual wants to work just with another agency." So it's great to accommodate that as much as possible. In terms of what you're legally obligated to do, and again, this is a very generalized answer, always talk to your lawyers. We are not that, so talk to your lawyers. But in general, if you're trying to fulfill your obligation of providing an interpreter or language services, you are not beholden to work with a specific agency or a specific interpreter. It's going to make your life easier if you do that most of the time, but that's not necessarily your legal obligation. So I would say that most of the time, if you have the option, yes, go ahead and honor that request of an individual who wants to work with a specific person or a specific agency. Sometimes that person's just not available and then they got to roll with it anyway. But are you absolutely obligated to do that? Typically the answer is no, with a giant caveat of, not a lawyer here, but your job, if you're in the situation, is to make sure that there is quality communication happening. Beyond that, the vessel of that quality communication is not something that you are specifically obligated to provide. So this is a great question. When you are dealing with dense and constant information coming in, the process of breaking that information down from one language and then outputting it into another is a very taxing and it's a really complicated process. So when you're in a doctor's office and a doctor says something to the patient, the interpreter now has a beat to take that information in, convey it to the patient, and then wait until that information comes back. Now that already is a pretty taxing environment, but imagine now you are listening to somebody who is giving a 90-minute speech and they are just talking. There is no time for you to get that break, to get that beat. So what happens, just like listening to somebody talk for 90 minutes, your mind can start to wander and you snap back and you say, oh man, I don't really know what they just said for the last 30 seconds. Imagine you're doing twice the work because you're not only taking in what they're saying, but you're also producing it in another language. So the idea that somebody can do an effective job at that over the course of really anything more than 20 or 30 minutes straight is really asking a lot. So typically what lots of agencies will do is send a team of 2 interpreters for any sort of what we call platform settings, whether that's theatrical or somebody giving a speech, things like that. You're going to have more than one interpreter up there. And what they do is they work together to feed each other words or to help move it along. So essentially you're going to have an interpreter here and an interpreter here, this one who is currently up in front of the stage, let's say, and they are doing the interpreting while this one is feeding them information. And every 15 to 20 minutes, they're going to switch spots. And now this one is going to be up there while this one is feeding them every information. And what that allows the interpreter who is not currently up in front of the stage to do is to get that mental break, to refresh, and to then get back up and keep going. So that's why you're getting a team of 2 interpreters, because if we just send one interpreter for a 2-hour presentation, there's almost no way that we're going to be able to provide quality communication. And it's just going to do, it's going to have a real psychological, mental drain on the original interpreter, to say nothing of the fact that specifically with sign language interpreters, there are real physical problems that come from overuse without any sort of real break. So that's the reason that you're going to see most agencies insist on 2 interpreters for platform settings. Guys, thank you so much for all the questions that you've sent in. We really, really appreciate the engagement, and we're happy to do another one of these if we get enough questions in to send out. So do us a favor, continue to follow us on social media, go to our YouTube page, our Twitter page, all the pages, follow us, subscribe, and keep sending in questions. And we're going to have more videos coming out weekly. Next week, we have a proper interview coming out for our interview series with an interpreter, somebody you probably are more interested in hearing from. But again, thank you so much for clicking on this video, and we will see you guys soon.